Hi, I'm Alicia.
And I'm Robin, and you're listening to Bowel Moments,
the podcast sharing real talk about the realities of IBD. Served on the rocks. This week, Robin was joined by guest host, friend of the show, and IBD dietitian Stacy Collins. They spoke to Yimin Teo. Yimin is a registered dietitian and owner of Herbs and Food, a virtual private practice specializing in digestive health and culturally sensitive nutrition counseling. They talked about Yimin growing up in Singapore and some of the cultural differences between Singapore and the United States that she's observed. They talked to her about working with comorbid diagnoses and inflammatory bowel disease. They talked about personalizing diet therapy to make it work for each person living with IBD. They talked about food accessibility and advocacy to make diets more available to all people with IBD. And they talk about the many bathrooms in Singapore. Cheers.
Welcome to Bowel Moments, everybody. This is Stacy Collins.
Hi, everybody. This is Robin. And as you can tell, I have a guest co-host with me tonight. Thank you, Stacy, for joining to be a part of this interview today. We are so excited because we have a newly minted IBD specialty RD on the show. Yimin, thank you for joining us.
Yay.
Thank you for having me. So honored to be here with you guys.
As always, our first unprofessional question is, what are you drinking?
I am drinking a sparkling red dragon fruit drink. Sparkling water. That's my favorite thing.
We love it. Stacy, what are you drinking tonight?
I'm having a Pinot Noir, I believe, and it's from Prophecy. Shout out to HEB. I also have a nice glass of room temperature water.
So I'm drinking iced coffee. I made the cold brew myself. So this is homemade cold brew coffee. I also have a Topo Chico lime with mint.
That's my favorite.
And still water. 3 beverages as usual for me. Cheers.
Cheers. Ding, ding, ding. Cling, cling.
Cheers. Second question for you, Yimin, is why did you choose to be a dietitian and specialize in GI and do further education into IBD?
Yeah, so it's been an interesting journey. So I really didn't set out wanting to be a dietitian. I was born and raised in Singapore, and my parents has always wanted to send me abroad to experience a different life from in a different country. And so I realized that I had to decide on a major. And honestly, going through the Singapore education system, like we're just taught to, just study like your English, math, sciences, and it's not really like, entirely too creative. So I never really thought about it. But I love to cook. I love to eat. Food is life. And so when I was deciding my major, my mom was like, oh, why don't you study nutrition? And I was like, cool, that sounds great. And that pretty much started my nutrition career. And partway through, I was debating between like food science and dietetics. And I realized I really don't want to just work in the lab all day. I want to talk to humans and learn about people's stories. So I then went into the dietetics route and then did all the prerequisites, became a dietitian. And at that point, I was thinking to myself, okay, I want to work in different workplaces to kind of experience what it's like. And as usual, in those situations, the first job that popped up is a clinical dietitian role. So I took it. And it was really, a lot of people say that it's boring. And for me, I got to work in multiple different facilities, with individuals that are, from underserved communities, people who are really fancy and, have a lot of resources. So for me, it was really good to see. I have gone to appreciate, having access to care, being able to afford food, resources, and things like that. And so from there, a couple years into clinical work, and I was thinking maybe it's time for me to start specializing in something and really find an area in nutrition that I really enjoy. So at that point, I went through all the kind of like a typical clinical RD route where you do ICU, you do all different surgical specialties and transplant and things like that. So I went through all that, and I was covering the GI service under internal medicine at USC, and I really didn't know much about IBD at that point. So I was that dietitian that, went into the room and just say, hey, how's it going? I'm so sorry you're having a lot of diarrhea and bloody stools, but let's talk about nutrition and getting you calories and protein. So that's kind of where it started. And when I, spent more time with IBD patients that got admitted, because it's really the worst time, right? Worst time in their lives. people don't know that they have IBD and maybe it's their first diagnosis. And so there's a lot of fear and trauma associated with this whole process. And, when I sat down with each patient, listened to their story, and I did go over time sometimes, but it's on my own accord. It was a salary job, but really listening to patients' experience of no one really talked about nutrition. I know that diet can worsen my symptoms, and if I don't eat, I feel better, but I also know that I have to. So it's this whole struggle and stress surrounding food, relationship with body, right? Because a lot of patients would say that, hey, a lot of people have been complimenting me because I look, slimmer and nicer. And that's not really what we're striving for here. We want to be nourished, right? We want to be able to get our disease under control, get it in remission. And so I, over time, realized that, that's actually something that I would love to talk to every single IBD patient about as much within my, realm or interactions with them. It's really raising the awareness of how important nutrition is in IBD. And as I learned about dietary therapies in IBD, I was like, oh, this is so cool. As a dietitian, we know that diet is powerful, with controlling diseases and stuff, but seeing that in action in IBD with studies backing it up, that was a whole new level to me. So I was just constantly learning every single day, learning through research, patient stories, and just trying to find whatever that I can. And I realized that, okay, this is really the field that I can always challenge myself, challenge my patients so that they can, nourish their body and be better. So yeah, that's kind of how I ended up in the field of IBD. And I just want to keep supporting patients in their journeys.
We love to hear it. That was amazing. You just found us randomly.
It's been a journey, but it's really nice. And I think the main part of the role as a dietitian is that you get to be, the patient's advocate. It's a tough job sometimes because in many interactions with certain providers, patients have heard and been told that diet doesn't matter, nutrition doesn't matter. I had a patient where her physician told her that you can just see a dietitian when you get into remission. It doesn't matter while you're in a flare. And so it's all these weird messaging that's out there, and it gives me a sense of purpose to be able to advocate for folks.
Yeah, we're happy to have you. I love to hear you say that you like to challenge patients, because I'm also a dietitian and I know that we know everyone about moments, we know. But I think that that's a unique way to phrase the challenge of being nourished. And you kind of spoke to that of we need you to be nourished, but you don't want to eat because you're in pain. And I think that it takes a really special, open-minded, critically aware person to kind of acknowledge that that's a challenge. So I just wanted to say I appreciate you for saying that.
That's nice to hear.
So can you just take us through what it was like as far as observing food culture from Singapore versus America?
Yeah, I think every individual who has, lived in a different country would have different experiences, but I think there's general, similar observations. So I would say personally for me in Singapore, a lot of the environment that I grew up in really focused on food bring people together. And a lot of the activities, family activities, celebrations, happy or sad, right? It all surrounds around having good food. And when you have good food around, you have good conversations. You have you build that emotional connection and strong support for people in your community. In our Chinese culture, one thing that we always ask as a greeting is that, have you eaten already or not? So instead of saying, hi, how are you? How's it going? It's more like, did you eat today? Have you eaten already? That's kind of I just want to make sure you're nourished. Right?
I love that.
It actually sounds like the South to me. When you walk into somebody's house in New Orleans, they're going to say, "Did you eat?"
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. When I was saying that phrase too, I realized that, it's kind of wonky when I say it too, because, when it comes across in different language, in Singlish, we say, you eat already? So it's a very short and concise way, just like how you guys have mentioned and when you guys are growing up too.
Yeah, it's a way of checking in on your people.
Exactly. So yeah, I think that has always been very much ingrained in me growing up. And it's not really good meals don't happen in isolation. It's always kind of tied to experiences, usually a lot of happy feelings. And then when you look back on into it, when you're chatting with friends and family, those are kind of like the moments where, oh my gosh, the food, when we had this food in this country, it was so good. Or when we had this food at the food court, it was really good. Things like that. So I think having a community and people that you can lean on for support, having those celebratory events, that was really, I didn't realize like I missed that so much when I moved to the US, because you're kind of like starting from scratch, right? Like you're trying to find your community, you're trying to like adapt to like a new education system, work system, work environment. And so I noticed that through my conversations with my friends, with patients, and they said like, oh, when I first came to the US, I really had to change the way I eat. And that could be like the type of food, it could be like seasonings, or like, for example, I mean, a classic example of what I hear, and it's been in some of the public health messaging too, is like a kid was saying like, oh, my classmates think that my meal smells bad. And this kid was bringing like kimchi and like cultural foods, right? And so I think like there's this component of like adaptation or assimilation so that we can navigate and try to survive in the system. And over time, I think for me, I still kept a lot of cultural foods that's important to me, but also find ways to integrate it creatively, and introducing it to friends and family. And I think that requires like a safe space and, more curious conversations from friends too, right? It's hard to just talk about it to someone who's not interested or who doesn't quite get it. So yeah, I think in that regard, everyone adapts differently. Some people just scrap, like they just don't think it's important for them. But with a lot of patients, I realize they like subconsciously still kind of hold on to that, because it's not exactly the food ingredient itself, it's like all the memories and comfort that's associated with that. So when we talk about removing certain cultural foods, or like when providers unintentionally say, hey, don't eat rice, or don't eat, I don't know, don't eat so much tortillas, I hear that a lot, like in our Mexican Latino communities, where they're saying like, oh, you need to cut down on beans and things like that. And it really impacts, one's emotional state too, right?
Yeah.
They're having all these emotional turmoil with navigating IBD itself. That's like a lot, right? And then you're adding this additional cultural layer that's making it even more stressful and potentially isolating them too, because it's like, oh, I don't want to hang out with my friends, or, go and eat at this new restaurant with people that I know because my provider just told me that I can't have those items. So I think there's a lot of the mental health aspect that needs to be discussed too, before we're just saying like, hey, don't eat this, eat that instead. So
Thank you for sharing that, because I feel like so much of what you said is speaking the same language of IBDers, because a lot of us have to learn how to navigate a lot of food culture. Robin and I both being from the South, where food is so ingrained in Robin and I both grew up with like crawfish boils for every life event, including funerals, And a lot of the plight of the IBD patient, I feel like, at least based on my experience, allow me to project for a moment, is learning how to still be a participant in those social circumstances without the food component, or feeling fearful about the food component, or certain that there would be pain. And so in a way, it is so isolating. And that's kind of like what you kind of expressed. You had to assimilate so that you could socially like fit in with other people, because or you had to find people who were open-minded about your cultural foods. And so I think that's really interesting, gives you kind of a lens into the chronic community that I don't think a lot of dietitians have.
yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily see it as like, oh, if you're coming from a different country or a different culture, that this would apply to you. I think, like you said, all IBD patients go through that. Like, I feel like the food culture in LA, where I'm at, it's very different than in Texas, than on the East Coast. So I think that aspect of being culturally sensitive as well also applies in this case, across America, right?
Yeah.
It's just, I think as providers, we should be more like sensitive to that, and really, it's hard to process all these feelings and trying to make these connections with being scared to reintroduce foods, and how do you navigate these social situations. Like, it's hard to do that in a really short visit. So like, definitely finding a dietitian, GI doctor, a psychologist, mental health clinician, etc., to really that you can connect with, and really creating space to talk about these things that are important to you.
Yeah.
So Like when I feel like very often we start off with saying, oh, a lot of patients would say, I'm scared to eat XYZ and I don't know what to do when I'm in a certain social situation. And usually that kind of starts, it starts the process of peeling back like the onion layers, and you're noticing, oh, there's actually a lot of, trauma that's associated with like certain foods causing symptoms. Right. And I think like it's important for us to recognize that too. So.
Yeah. How do you go about doing that? Like, do you even think that's a possible conversation in an inpatient clinical dietitian setting versus outpatient? Because you've kind of done everything. You've done clinical inpatient, you've done outpatient, and you also have your own private practice. So like, how do those conversations kind of vary so people understand maybe behind the curtain what that looks like?
Yeah. I mean, there's a reason why I'm in private practice.
Cheers.
Snaps to that.
Because I think like over time with my inpatient experience, I think like it's really hard to get to that in 5 to 15 minutes where you're really there to ask those questions of, did you have any weight loss recently? Did you have a poor appetite? And like, here's some Ensures and Boost, and like, see you later, next patient. And unless you have extra time to like connect with a patient, but you have so many patients in the hospital, how are you going to physically do that? Right. Yeah. And so when you're in the outpatient setting, you have those opportunities for longer sessions, that patients have to, depending on the provider, maybe the patients have to ask for it. Maybe it's not available. I think in a really ideal situation, like there's a multidisciplinary care team. And then, they can say, hey, I would love for you to touch base with a dietitian. But really, how many patients have access to that? So I think that's just to kind of like throw in another story here. So when I was at USC, I actually didn't really have the intention to start my private practice that quickly. I knew that that's always my eventual goal. But, there has been multiple situations where like patients were actually asking me, we'll get to like, kind of like the more sensitive part of their IBD journey or even just their chronic illness journey. And they would say, oh, do you take clients when you're, outside of the hospital? And I was like, I don't. And I think after a couple interactions, like of similar interactions, I started thinking like, I think there's something here. I think this is a call from patients that there's a need. Patients want to talk about things like that. They need a space to be able to do that. And for someone who's, a provider who's able to do so with them and go through their journey with them, being their cheerleader, going through ups and downs. And, there's been a lot of moments in private practice where, I would shed happy tears with my patients because there were breakthroughs. Right. Yep. And then there were days that they just feel like really overwhelmed and really scared, and seeing how, being with them through that tough time and process, giving the space and the time that they need, eventually coming through the other side, that is really, really satisfying in my practice. So yeah, I think it's kind of a full circle, if you would.
I feel like a lot of times patients meet with dietitians in the hospital and they don't have any sort of knowledge or even curiosity about the experience of people with IBD. And I think that's because like our education kind of does us a, tragic disservice. Doing well, end of the day. A tragic disservice by just giving us such general guidance. But in a way, like we're kind of trained to be plug and play healthcare practitioners. And that's kind of what we end up being for a lot of us who end up in clinical and are just seeing everyone from like your cabbage to dialysis all in the same day in the hospital. Like, how can you possibly be an expert in IBD?
Yeah. And I mean, I am willing to admit that, I was that dietitian that started off not knowing what the difference between IBS and IBD was. And I'm not ashamed to like admit that, because during my internship, there were not a lot of GI patients. So, and yeah, exactly like you said, Stacy, like a lot of the patients had heart failure, had diabetes and dialysis. So got really good at that. But I think eventually when I got to like a, more higher level of care hospital, when they're seeing more complicated patients, and I started seeing more and more GI and IBD patients, that's kind of where I was like, hey, there's something here. There is a gap in my knowledge in my brain. I need to like figure that out.
Also, like we wanted your help too. We're probably like, please help.
Yeah. Yes. And I think what was interesting too was that patients with IBD that came into the hospital, I mean, I've worked at a couple, and I don't see that as like a quote unquote high risk diagnosis. If we're waiting till like, 7 days during admission and seeing them by day 7, or like maybe the patients already went home, like, I think that's also like another gap where like we should, when patients are coming in with severe flares, they are a high risk patient, and, all dietitians should be involved. And for me, I think when I recall, like when I was seeing IBD patients at USC, I actually was like, okay, I want to check in with every single one of them, because everyone's losing like 20, 30 pounds and like barely eating. So even if they're not high risk, to me, they like not high risk per protocol, like to me, they are. And so I just took it upon myself and just checked in with patients and, try to do my own research and just be really honest. And said, like, I don't know much about IBD yet. I'm still learning, but these are all the resources that I can find. And, free to reach out to me after. Here's my contact info if you have any questions. And so it was kind of grasping at straws. But if I feel that way as a provider, I can't imagine how patients feel, right?
Yeah.
So that to me, it's kind of like we all need to work on that as healthcare providers.
Yeah. It sounds like you're really passionate about giving patients resources and education. And I know that you've done education in Singapore as a dietitian, which is so cool. And you've also done educational events in LA. Do you have any comparisons between those two experiences at all?
I think probably also like a cultural difference where individuals I don't know if it's all parts of the US, but at least like in general, Americans that I meet are more outspoken and they're more willing to ask questions. And I think like when I spoke with the Crohn's and Colitis Society in Singapore, and I was leading a support group, and it was talking about current diet therapies and IBD. And a lot of the patients that, who were vocal and was willing to share the experience, they have had IBD for like 20, 30 years. They're like veterans. Right. And because they have done so much trial and error, I think as part of their lived experience, and they see results. So they were so excited to like share, they said, oh, I've tried this, I've tried that, and it worked and it didn't. And you should tell your other patients too, because like more people need to know about this. And so it's seeing that enthusiasm that was really, really cool. But on the other end of the spectrum, you have parents with kids who are like freaking out because their kids are just having really severe disease and they don't know what to do about it. They're at a complete loss. And that is consistent, across all countries, across all communities.
Yeah.
Like, if you are starting the IBD journey and it's usually pretty rough and just feeling all the stress and the unknowns, you're not sure what would work and what wouldn't. And the dynamic, I think culturally too, one of the conversations I had with the family was that they wanted to pursue EEN and have the kid start EEN, and the kid wasn't willing to, because the kid was saying, well, what are my classmates going to say when they see me drinking formula? Like, ew, I don't want to do that. And so I think there's that family dynamic. And I think we're getting close to, like, at that time it was December and there was a lot of holiday celebrations around. And so there's this concept of like, we want to make sure we have face, and like, it's kind of a term where we don't want to be embarrassed. We don't want to be looked down upon. And having chronic illness in general, that on its own is, people are ashamed of that, right? Yeah. And needing to navigate that emotion, but also how others would perceive them, is so stressful. Sometimes people they're just saying, I would just isolate myself at home. I don't know who has this condition. I don't know who to talk to. And so I think like the role of support groups is really helpful to connect individuals. But I think in general, having this experience in different countries, I realized that all IBD patients have more in common than differences. Amazing. We all go through the ups and downs, and we all want someone who is there to listen and offer that safe space and provide the support, evidence-based support, that I must say. There's a lot of wonky things out there when patients are saying like, look, one of my patients in Singapore, she was saying, well, a lot of my family members are recommending me take, certain herbs and tinctures, and I don't know like what it's going to do to my IBD. And truly, that is the gap that is happening right now is we don't have much research on it, right? We're
Right.
just barely getting started on diet therapies being amazing with inducing remission, but we don't really have much info about how can that be translated to different cultures, to different countries. What are the repercussions of implementing diet therapies and how it can really impact mental health, relationship with food, where it's already impacted by IBD itself. So
Yeah, that makes total sense. Something along those lines that I was curious about as you were talking is I know that you and I both have colleagues in New Zealand, and they have kind of taught us that New Zealanders are more open to diet therapy because they have fewer or different medical treatment options than we do in the States. Is that something that you've seen in Singapore?
I can't speak to it completely, but I know that there is fewer biologic options compared to the US. And so when it comes to, I was actually talking with a fellow Singaporean doctor. Shout out to Dr. Salazar. She's amazing at Singapore General Hospital. And when we're exchanging, experiences on patients' perspectives on diet therapy, I think again, there's no one size fits all. Every patient, you'll have a different conversation with each patient, but especially among young adults, they seem to be more open to diet therapy than older adults. And I think with older adults, you also have to consider they will look for natural therapies or alternative therapies. And in Singapore in particular, there's a huge emphasis right now also on using Chinese medicine as preventative care. So it's very much kind of integrated or intertwined in our medical system that there is options for both.
Wow. So that can be part of a patient's monitoring strategy, essentially. Wow. That's really cool.
I wish there's more studies on it, honestly, because I think that's also another way to monitor safety, right? Like ultimately, we want it to be safe for patients. And if it's an effective strategy, I think we need more evidence and data on that. And if they can be used complementary, like why not?
Yeah. Definitely need more evidence. I mean, when I saw an acupuncturist who was trained in China, had migrated to the United States, she also wanted me to try Chinese herbs. And I was like, I am going to have to pass just because I don't know, right? I don't know what it's going to do to my IBD, and I don't know how it's going to interact with the medication I'm already on. And like, there's just so many unknowns there. There's something else that you said that really struck me, and I wanted to comment on it. Even though there are people who are more outspoken in the US, I feel like the IBD experience is isolating no matter where you are, right? There's just so much stigma associated with it because of the nature of the disease, because of the symptoms that people experience, because you are locked in your bathroom or close to a bathroom or locked in your house. And I just feel validated, but also sad that you shared that. It's like a similar experience, really, no matter where we are.
Yeah, I think that's why we need more advocacy and we need more IBD dietitians, right? That can support more patients across the globe, really. And I think this is like a personal ideal case situation where I'm like, I would love to see IBD dietitians in every single country. In Singapore, that is kind of just barely starting. There's like GI dietitians, but I don't think there is specific ones that specializes in IBD. And I don't know about other countries, but I would say like that might be the case as well. So yeah, one thing I would say about Singapore though is that we have a lot of bathrooms around. That was my personal quest when I was going around the island. I was like, let me take a look because
Stacey, trip to Singapore.
I know. I'm like, okay, you've sold me. Let's go.
Yeah, it's very, very accessible. The only thing is because you have to walk everywhere in this mainly public transportation. So there's like other considerations too, right? But there's been definitely more campaigns and nonprofits raising awareness about like accessibility. That is still like a huge thing in Asia where like there's still a lot of stigmas surrounding that. But yeah, we do have a lot of bathrooms.
Are they clean?
Oh, okay. Half and half.
Okay, we'll take it. We'll take it.
Quantity over quality at this point, and then we'll elevate the quality eventually.
It always I'm astounded by the stigma because literally everyone goes to the bathroom, from newborn to senior citizen over 100 years old goes to the bathroom.
Everybody poops.
Everybody poops. What is happening here, people? Why is this such a taboo thing?
I mean,
Everybody farts, everybody burps. Well, I didn't fart for a long time because of my surgery, but now that I got the J pouch, my GI tract is making up for it. But anyway, everybody does these things. It's just a normal bodily function.
you guys mentioned J pouch, but also like in general, like patients with ostomies, I feel like that is a whole other, category of patients where they also face a lot of stigma. I mean, my grandma, she had a bowel perforation. Unfortunately, she made it. She's good. But going through that process of having a new colostomy and like learning how to manage that, and like all ostomies has their own personalities and need to learn how to like deal with it. All my patients have named their ostomies, which I think is really cute. And so I think that process from like a family member perspective, that has been really eye-opening, because you don't think about the stuff. Like for me, I go to the bathroom, I poop, I get out, right? And with her, we think about, okay, did you bring enough supplies when we're going to the shopping mall? Like, do we have, is grandma feeling okay? Is she mentally ready to like go out? We have to prep her, like give her a couple days to like be ready for it. So there's that mental stress too that I think like people forget, on top of like managing everything else about IBD, right? And then when you're out, where is the bathroom? You gotta like scope out the place, right? And then depending on the bathroom setup, is there enough space? Like, is there tissue available? Like, you gotta be like fully prepared. And so I think going through the experience with family members, that has also been definitely eye-opening. So many things that you guys have to do.
So many things.
Yeah.
In 3 years, I don't think I've shared this story on here, but when I had to have my colon removed and I had an ostomy for the first time, my sweet little grandparents told me a story of, I guess it had to be my great great uncle who had a farm accident and had like the first colostomy at whatever hospital that they were at in Iowa, Nebraska, whatever. And they repeatedly told me that story to try to make me feel better about having an ostomy. I just thought it was adorable that they were, sharing that experience. I really feel like there need to be more advancements in ostomy supplies and that way that works. But thinking about how he would have had to, he probably just had like a plastic bag that he taped to his abdomen or something.
Oh my God.
That, like in the 30s or 40s or 50s, whenever that was.
Yeah.
Can you imagine that? I've had 2 temporary ostomies and I don't like the supplies as they are. And my 2 ostomies were 20 years apart. And there was literally the only advancement in ostomy supplies was Velcro at the bottom of the bag, as opposed to a clip. Like, ostomy supply companies, can we do something about the way that ostomies work? But anyway, thinking about your grandmother having to navigate that too, and then family members having to support, and then all of the stigma that goes along with that in Asian culture.
Yeah, because she loves to be pretty, and having an ostomy bag is not pretty, right?
No, it is not. It's smelly. I don't think it's smelly, but like there is that stigma that goes along with it's going to smell. And
yeah, I think we also need more ostomy nurses.
Oh my God, preach.
That can share this information, have more support groups, webinars, whatever, to really destigmatize it, right? Allow patients and caregivers to have those conversations, because I think for both of you, you guys are managing your own J pouches, but I think like for other individuals who need to depend on family for help, there's definitely that caregiver burden that I think it's not talked about as much as well. So,
oh my gosh, I think just the caregivers, I often think like Zach is someone who's been through more than most people his age have had to go through, just as a caregiver and seeing what I've gone through. And, it's been non-linear, but his support's been steady the whole time. And I would like to say something flowery, like, and we came out stronger because of it, but like he's just a pretty cool and great guy, but I truly don't think many people his age would have the emotional capacity to endure all that's been hurled in his direction. And he's never complained or anything, but like whenever I got my initial ostomy surgery, my total colectomy, I was too malnourished to like stand and change my ostomy at the same time. I was too tired to do that. So I was having to like lay flat on the floor and he would have to come change my ostomy. Robin's pointing, me too.
I did. I had to lay on the floor to change my ostomy. I was too weak to stand up and change it.
Yeah, he would change it for me, or he would, once I got more independent, he would hold the mirror so that I could change it myself. But it would take like 20 minutes because I just would get so winded during that whole process. It was anyway,
A
but I
long
also got
process.
yeah, I mean it's not even it takes muscle memory. Yeah. And I'm sure you've seen that with your grandmother, but I got ostomy education from a social worker whose mom had an ostomy. Like I didn't even see an ostomy nurse.
Yeah. Yes. Stacy, I wish somebody would have videoed me trying to change my ostomy laying on the floor. I was laying on the floor in my bathroom next to the bathtub, and I had like a stool on one side of me, the bathtub on the other, and I propped the mirror over me between the stool and the bathtub so that I could see my ostomy so I could change it because I couldn't stand up long enough to change it. And then it wouldn't stay. Like I'd go to sit up and stand up and it wouldn't stay on. It would leak almost immediately. I was in tears this was the second time around. This is when I had the loop ostomy, which I feel like is the devil.
It's a hard one.
Everyone, if you're getting an ostomy, an endoleostomy, much easier to change, much easier to manage, much easier. But the loop is like no fun at all. And oh my gosh, I was in tears like almost every single time I had to change it.
What a time. The time was had. Eamon, I have a
Yes.
question. So I know that you have specific training in IBD nutrition, but you also have just like other areas of GI that you really love, like celiac, and I'll let you speak to all the others, but I know that you like all of GI. I don't think you necessarily discriminate. So how do you help a person who say, because I've noticed this comes up a lot in conversation with patients or prospective patients. They're like, but are you sure you can help me? Because I also have a history of like pancreatitis, and I also have a history of prediabetes, and I also have a history of short gut. Like, how do you talk to patients that are concerned about those multiple diagnoses all at one time?
Yeah. And well, it's not fun for the patient, but as a clinician, it's challenging and it always keeps me on my toes, right? And for me, having that inpatient experience where I have taken care of patients with all of those diagnoses, I realize like patients with IBD, if you're lucky, you don't have many comorbidities with it. But like you said, other individuals might have short gut, pancreatitis, kidney disease, right? So I think leveraging my past, experience with managing those conditions with patients, I often say like, hey, this has been my experience with working with all these demographics and specializing in IBD now, I'm in a really good place to help you because I can take all these knowledge for different medical conditions and combine it and personalize it for you. I always say that every IBD patient is different. Even if you have the same diagnosis, same disease phenotype or like same disease activity, there's so much more, that makes us unique as a human, right? Let's not talk about being a patient for a second. Like we all have different lived experiences and preferences. And I think for me, I always say that there's no one size fits all. And having a clinician who have had those different varied experience, if anything, is more helpful for you because then that provider can help you to personalize those recommendations so that you can nourish yourself better while still keeping in mind, like, for example, if you have, kidney disease, we're worried about fluid overload and being mindful about hydrating appropriately. If you're having high ostomy output, having chronic kidney disease because of dehydration in the past, having a dietitian who really understands kidney disease is really helpful in those situations too. So yeah, I think that's why I don't just see IBD patients, I see all patients because that keeps me fresh on my toes with all the conditions. And many patients do have overlap, like with IBS, SIBO, and I see that a lot in my practice too.
I love that you said that because I was talking to a patient just this week and I had that thought, like, it's almost like you need to just remove the patient experience and just say human experience. Because I was talking to a person recovering from a resection this week and I was like, I think we need to leave this chapter in the rear view and let's talk about how to get you back to your life. How do we get you back to doing the activities that you love, to being the college student that you enjoy being, to being the athlete that you enjoy being? Like, it's more about, and just to hear you say diet personalization, because we have been trained with all these lovely algorithmic sort of approaches to therapeutic diets. But at the end of the day, like personalization to make the diet not only enjoyable, but sustainable and nutritionally complete and all of the things, like it's ultimately it's the personalization piece that's key and not so much like the therapeutic diet necessarily. And then hearing you also say like just how the socio-cultural aspect of food matters, because I think we talk a lot about that, like, okay, this person's going to be on a Mediterranean diet. How do we generalize that to the Tex-Mex diet? Like that's a lot of the conversations that I have. Generalization is not a skill that everyone has, but also like, how do you personalize that to the mom who's working 3 jobs and getting 3 kids out the door? Like, how do you make that diet make sense to that person who isn't the optimal, easiest person to actually help? When we look at these beautiful case studies, you're like, well, that would be great, but then there's like the real
there's
world
that nuance.
Yeah,
Absolutely. And I there was this one physician that I connected with a long time ago. And when I was presenting the case to her of a BD patient, I was like, I don't really know what to do with this patient. Like, what are your thoughts medically? Like, how can I'm just freaking out. Like, what can I do for this patient? And then she said, what are you trying to do? And I was like, oh, I'm trying to see like which diet would fit this patient. And this is my early learning phase, just trying to understand diet therapies and things. And I think one really valuable advice or reminder for me that she mentioned that stuck with me was that, are we treating the patient or are we treating ourselves? And in the context of like, well, are we trying to, because we are trained to, follow, the workflow of like, oh, if this patient presents with, this specific disease activity and this diet will be appropriate, right? It's like kind of like matching those puzzle pieces. And then you get that sense of satisfaction. Like, oh my gosh, yeah, I have these patients on, however many patients on this diet therapy. But I think we also need to focus on that one person as a human. Right? Like whether diet therapy is indicated or not, I think what's more important is also what the patient wants. Like, what is their goal?
What are their goals? What's not your goal, but what's their goal?
Like you can recommend all the things that you want. I still do my due diligence. I say, okay, well, clinically, based on your disease presentation, like maybe like EEN or CDED or other stuff would be, appropriate. And we have data to support that. But is this something that you're interested in? Because if it's not, and you're forcing the patient to do it, then it's creating more stress, more distrust. And I always am nervous about that impact, unintended consequences on the relationship with food. Because when you're having people restrict certain food categories, if they don't have to, or if they don't want to, I think some patients have told me that, after being on certain diet therapies, there's a sense of resentment, like they lost a part of their lives. And some patients thrive on it. So I'm not here as like a naysayer for diet therapy, but I think it needs to be personalized, not just, looking at the disease itself, but also like that person's lived experience and story.
Yeah, I remember seeing a doctor one time on rounds in the hospital, and she was teaching a fellow, and she was like, we treat the patient, we don't treat the lab value. Mm-hmm. And that kind of stuck with me. She was like, we treat the person, and maybe we should I should think about like how I phrase things instead of like, we treat the patient like it's a human. I'm a human. Robin's a human. But have you ever seen anything like, because I know we've been hearing more about how diet isn't a benign intervention. Can you just explain what that means? Or even what diet therapy is? Because I think we've been saying that word, but I don't know if people know what that means.
Yeah, for sure. So diet therapy, it's been studied and researched that with certain food components, when they're included or excluded, so far mostly excluded, and that has been shown to help patients get into remission. So there is then 2 parts of it. You're using diet therapy as induction therapy or as an adjunct therapy, right? Along with medications, like if you're on a biologic or something like that. And so I think it's important to have that discussion of, are we using diet as a therapeutic intervention, like how you are using it, using biologics to do that, using medications to do that, or we are focusing on using diet to manage symptoms, to improve quality of life? Because I think sometimes those conversations should happen because we want to prevent unintended harm. But having patients and providers be on the same page and clarify that. Because I mean, Stacey, you probably have the same thoughts too. Like, as a provider, then your approach would be completely different if you're using diet as therapy or suggesting, recommending, nutrition strategies to help reduce symptoms, help patients regain their weight, for example, things like that. So I think that will be the main difference. And I always show patients more resources, or explain the fact that, okay, with Mediterranean diet, with CDED, with SCD, all these different diets, what is required and what has been studied to show its efficacy.
Mhm.
And we don't know if the results would still be the same if you are deviating from that. So there's a level of, adherence or strictness with that has been studied. So that's what we're going off of as clinicians. But ultimately, is that something that's realistic and practical for you?
Mhm.
If not, it's not the end of the world. So I think showing patients that there is this spectrum, that there are options, you can have it be in place alongside with medications or not. But one thing I would say with diet therapy is definitely having specific monitoring parameters.
Yes.
So if you are talking to a provider about, you're interested in using diet as therapy, and they say like, oh, okay, let's start you on CDED. Okay, bye. Here's a handout. That is, I think, is a very dangerous situation, because if you're using it to induce remission, then what is the time frame? When should I be scoped again? When should I get my labs drawn? How do I know if it's working or not? Is it working enough? Because if not, we gotta pivot and find another way to get us into remission. So I always talk about it with my patients in my practice, that these are the questions that, you should write it down or discuss with your provider, versus just saying like, okay, I'm interested in using diet. Because I think right now there's so much information about diet therapy out there, and it's changing so quickly too, that maybe not all providers are up to date with it. Some are not as much. And I always empower patients to, be in the driver's seat. You can have those conversations. You can advocate for yourself. It is okay to do that. If anything, you should do that.
Yeah, that's something that I've learned from this podcast and just being around Robin's orbit for so many years is just like, be the squeaky wheel, be the squeaky wheel. Like no one knows what you're going through except for you, and you have to take care of yourself. You have to speak up for yourself. No one's going to do it for you. So, yeah.
And in our culture too, that's a huge thing. Like, you don't want to question authority. You don't want to show that you are unsure, but you still have all these questions, right? And so I think sometimes might have to break those cultural stereotypes a little bit.
Yeah.
Ask for what you want, ask for what you need. This is beyond IBD too. This is just general life advice as well.
Yeah.
Reminder for myself too.
Right? The human experience, yes.
Yes. Lean into community.
Yeah, we need community. I was just talking to my friend Venus Kalami, who's a GI pediatric dietitian out of Northern California, and she was saying something that we forget about a lot of these diets when we talk about blue zones and people are living so long in these places. They're going on hikes with their friends, and they're hydrating themselves with their families, and they're drinking wine here and there with their dinner, and they have like a very strong sense of community. They're eating the grains that are like, indigenous to their cultural lands. They're able to participate in lots of life areas. They have paid maternity, paternity leave. Okay. they have all the resources to have like a pretty good life. And so I think that sometimes as dietitians, especially, we're guilty of being like so hyper focused on diet and nutrition and ingredients, when it really is a quality of life, like you said. So yeah.
It is. I have a question for both of you now. Whenever someone starts talking about a specific diet, and the Mediterranean diet is thrown around a lot in IBD, that's a whole trigger for me, because there's lots of different cultures that are all around the Mediterranean, and they all could be considered Mediterranean diet. But I digress. It's a very whitewashed way to describe that, calling it the Mediterranean diet. I feel like diet is one of the things that can be easy but not simple for people to or simple but not easy for people to integrate. And also, it is a very privileged viewpoint because people don't have accessibility. So I guess my question is, how can we change that narrative to where it is understood that diet is a simple way to approach it, but it's not easy. And it's not always accessible. Like, not everybody has the privilege or the accessibility or the finances or to do any of these diets, quote unquote diets, that are prescribed for IBD patients.
Yeah.
I would say the first thing is increasing insurance coverage for dietitians, period, and specifically for GI disorders. And I include
Period. Okay, I'm sorry, I interrupted you. Go ahead. I just wanted to put a period on that.
Yes. And I think that would improve access. It wouldn't resolve it, but at least allowing patients to have that option that, more GI or IBD dietitians are able to accept insurance because we can then pay our bills and, show up as our best self for our patients and being able to support patients through diet therapy. It's simple, but not easy in the sense, like, I totally appreciate that comment because it's so true. Like, I feel like a lot of times we talk about eating. Let's just use an example, eating more fruits and vegetables. Very simple, but how are you going to do it, right? And what kinds of fruits and vegetables, in what setting, and how much? Like, there's all these questions that's, I think, oversimplified. So when we're talking about the Mediterranean diet, I always explain it in a way that to, patients of different cultural backgrounds and say, okay, these are the main concepts, right? We're not necessarily eating like people who are living in the Mediterranean area because, I mean, you could if you want to, but like, I would say eat your cultural foods, and we can take what we know right now, which is, more fiber diversity, whole grains, beans and legumes, nuts and seeds. And honestly, I can tell you across different cultures that that's already in place in like traditional cultural diets. It's just with westernization, with industrialization, we're really straying away from that. And it's almost like bring people back to their roots in a way. Let's re-explore our cultural heritage. Let's re-explore our cultural diets because they have so much health benefits. I can't tell you how many times where like a lot of, our cultural foods have became superfoods in the US over the past decade or so. I mean, like goji berries, like monk fruit and all that kind of stuff. It's traditional in the Chinese culture, and it comes with health benefits. It has all these antioxidants and etc. And so going back to that, and I think like showing patients like it is simple in a way that it's already there. It's already there for you. You grew up with it. How can we then lean into it? And then once I feel like when you start unlocking that connection with your culture and your food, you unlock those relationship with your community as well, and like just all these things that would benefit your mental health, like Stacey, like you mentioned earlier, like in the blue zone, right? Like where individuals are doing all these activities, with their friends and family, they're eating according to cultural diets. It comes in a package. And I think like sometimes, unfortunately, with diet studies, we are trying to cherry pick out just the diet part, and we forget that diet and lifestyle factors are all synergistic. They have a synergistic effect. Yep. That's why diet studies are hard. And so I think hopefully there's more and more providers and clinicians who recognize that and take that into considerations when we are talking about diet therapies and IBD, or in general to, for any chronic diseases.
I am in full agreement. And especially whenever you said this begins like with dietitians needing insurance coverage. Yes, that's a hell yes for me. And then also we need doctors who were beneficiaries of the school lunch program. We need doctors who were helped by dietitians because they had that accessibility. We need social workers who have familiarity with local food banks to be involved in patient care. We need systemic change to happen so that people who are not in ivory towers continuing to get Harvard education, continuing to work for the best institutions, continuing to help the people with the very best access, we need that to change. And that's what's ultimately going to change the narrative, is by people highlighting not the prettiest research that's Mediterranean because it's white, because that's the people that are showing up in research. We need funding to go to these underserved areas whenever we're having to rely on community gardens to see how that's impacting a person's accessibility. And then also we have new research coming out of Mount Sinai that talks about people with IBD are experiencing food insecurity, so they are having to resultantly eat more processed food. So how do we flip the script? We have to get people food accessibility first and foremost. And that's not something that's talked about. There's this pervasive undercurrent in IBD that's talked about, the isolation aspect, which we talked about today. Whenever people and influencers are highlighting all of the ingredients in isolation, but they're not zooming out from their plate and showing us what their accessibility looks like. Who are these people having the meal with? Are they just having it by themselves? Are they not even having the meal, but they're just taking the picture for the video to make someone feel fearful about their food choices so that they can feel a sense of elitism? There's so much about this that has to change, but it starts with, I think, change on a systemic level, which is unfortunate, and making sure that people have accessibility to the things that are going to nourish them. Just today in clinic, I had to talk to someone about frozen fruits, canned vegetables. I was like, that is the reality of your circumstance. Stop it with the probiotic supplement that's costing you $125 a month and buy your kids some frozen vegetables. Like, that's where we need to put our efforts. And no one wants to talk about that on social media. It's a narrative that needs to change, but we need people to appreciate and understand the nuance too. Sorry about my soapbox.
It's whatever that's accessible and realistic for you to incorporate. And all the things about food accessibility and systemic change, Stacey, that you've mentioned, like that is unfortunately like the challenge. And I feel like it shouldn't be a privilege. It should be a right.
It should be a right.
And I feel like when that issue, that gap of not being able to buy fruits and vegetables, not being able to buy enough food for the family, when those systemic barriers and social determinants of health issues are addressed, then we can start talking about diet therapies. You're doing more harm than good if you're not looking at the bigger picture.
Yeah.
So, okay, Stacey, do you want to ask the last question?
Yes.
Okay.
Amen. If you could give one word of advice to the providers in the IBD community and one word of advice to the humans in the IBD community, what would you say?
So I'm just going to share the phrase that I have been using to guide myself with, like in my career or in my daily interactions with others, and just like a mindset thing. And I think this is an African proverb based on like what I researched, but I'm not quite sure exactly. So don't quote me on that. But the phrase is, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And I feel like that is very much how my approach is when it comes to patient care. And when I see all the, fellow amazing clinicians, Stacey, like yourself, and other clinicians out there, I feel like there's this collaborative effort and energy that everyone's putting together to better IBD care and IBD nutrition care. So stay curious and supportive, be open-minded, listen to patients' experiences and stories. I feel like, that's how I got here. I wouldn't have gotten into IBD if it wasn't for, patients who are willing to share and advocating for themselves. And so we can all work together and better the world, better IBD.
Beautiful. Loved it.
Yes. Thank you so much. We really appreciate you taking the time to be on the show. And thank you for joining us. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Cheers, everybody.
Cheers.
If you liked this episode, please rate, review, subscribe, and even better, share it with your friends. Cheers.